I always teach during the Jesus season this year on something from Matthew that you're going to read this week. So what we talk about today, you will encounter this week. And there were lots of good choices this week. For instance, this week you're going to find out that Jesus is starting to go public about the fact that he needs to go to Jerusalem to be persecuted and killed and raised again. You're going to read about something called the Transfiguration this week. All of those were good subjects. But let me start today by asking you this simple question. How much faith in God do you have? Now, given that I'm sitting in front of a room of Americans in the year 2015, 90% of us, give or take, would say emphatically that we do believe in God. How much do you? It would seem like an important question for a group of Christian people like us, since we think that our entire relationship with God hangs on faith. It is by grace that you are saved through faith, St. Paul says in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 8, for instance. So how much faith do you have? Maybe the more important question is, how do you know? It'd be one thing for me to tell you, well, I have all kinds of faith in God. I trust him tons. How do you know? Do you just take my word for it? How would I know about you? How can you know about yourself? And really, in the end, what difference does it make? So most Americans walk around in the year 2015 and say they have faith in God. What difference does that make? Do you see it making a difference in the lives of 90% of the American people that you know? And in the culture around them? I want you to keep those questions in mind today as we interact with this passage in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 17. Now, I'm not going to read this out loud to you. What we are going to do is walk through it, and we're going to interpret it together while it's up there on the screen. So you can look at the text, and I'm going to help you walk through it and maybe begin to pull it apart and understand it with some depth. When they came to the crowd, that crowd is important to keep in mind because of something that Jesus is going to say later in the passage. This is not something that happens in private. What we're going to read about today happens with a crowd gathered around. A man came to and knelt before Jesus, saying, Lord, have mercy on my son, for he is an epileptic and suffers terribly. He often falls into the fire and into the water. A father approaches Jesus. He is acting much like some people you encountered already in the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew chapter 9, the opening verses, where a group of friends lift up a paralyzed man on his sleeping pallet and carry him to Jesus. This son of this father was probably not capable of exercising much faith or interest in Jesus at all, given his affliction. But this father was acting out of love and faith on behalf of his son. Matthew was not a medical doctor. He did not have an MD from an accredited medical institution after the advances of the modern medicine and the scientific method. These are ancient people. That man is an ancient person. Matthew, who's recording this, is an ancient person. What's wrong with the son? We don't know. Is this a mental illness? Is this a physical illness? We don't know. It looked like or acted like epilepsy. This is not a doctor's diagnosis, however. Here's what we do know. Whatever this affliction was, it was severe. So severe that this son would lose control of his mind and body and would throw himself uncontrollably into the cooking fire on occasion, or would throw himself uncontrollably into the stream or the river or the sea of Galilee and almost drown. This father was desperate. There was no cure. There was no hospital. There was no expert who could fix this. And this was his beloved son, who may have had this affliction his entire life. And so this broken-hearted dad brings his broken son to Jesus. But then interestingly, this father tells Jesus, by the way, I brought my son to your disciples, and they couldn't fix this. Jesus' disciples were apparently doing what Jesus had told them to do in a passage you've already encountered in the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew chapter 10, where Jesus sends out his followers to do his work. You remember that? And sure enough, that's what they were doing. They were going out, and they were praying for and healing the sick. They were teaching his message. They were expanding God's kingdom. But in this case, the dad approaches the disciples to do what Jesus asked them to do, and it doesn't work. And Jesus' first response, down there in the second paragraph on this screen, is frankly fairly cantankerous. It's a little brusque, don't you think? Who's he saying that to exactly? Well, this is where it helps to maybe not see this in English and see it in ancient Greek. In English, you can't tell who the you is. In ancient Greek, you can. In ancient Greek, those are plurals. It's not about the dad. The dad hasn't done anything wrong. It's about the crowds. Apparently, the crowds are gathered around. And who knows what they're saying to this dad as he brings his broken son to Jesus to be healed. Maybe there are whispers of doubts. Maybe there are sniggers of laughter, because nobody should trust Jesus this much. You know the crowds weren't helping. And in this case, Jesus was fed up with it. How many times do you have to see me say supernatural things? How many times do you have to see me do supernatural things? How many times do you have to see me change a life before you'll believe? He was exceedingly frustrated with those crowds who gathered around and had veiled interest but extraordinary doubt. And this is what happens next. Sure enough, Jesus does what his disciples couldn't. And the son is healed. How did it happen? I don't know. What happened exactly? I don't know. All Matthew is doing for you is describing the fact that through this son's interaction with Jesus, something that caused him and his family extraordinary pain for all of his life was gone. And then his disciples do what you and I would have done. After all the hubbub dies down, the son and the father joyously leave, the crowd perhaps begins to dissipate. His disciples say to him, help us understand here. Why did this not work? We have been doing your work, trying to teach other people what you have taught us. Why in this particular case could we not do what you wanted us to do for this little boy? And this is where we need to pay attention. Jesus replied to his followers that day and to us 2,000 years later, because of your little faith. For truly I tell you, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, move here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you. This is obviously exaggeration. It's hyperbole. How do I know that? Well, because Jesus wasn't a show-off. He didn't do miracles just for the sake of showing off. So he would not have been a big fan of somebody pointing their magic finger or wand in a mountain and saying, move from here to there. How do I know that? Well, in Matthew chapter 4, when Satan tempted Jesus in the wilderness, the second temptation was very much like that. He said to Jesus, why don't you go throw yourself off the temple and then the angels will catch you? And Jesus said, no thanks. Because I'm not a show-off. But Jesus' point in this exaggeration is exceedingly clear. Yeah? The problem here was their little faith. And if that they just had faith that was as small as a tiny mustard seed, then nothing would be impossible for God to do through them. So here's Jesus' quiet counsel to his followers that day. If you only have a little bit of faith in God Almighty, he can do extraordinary things through you. And in this case, it's not for you. It is for the other people around you in your life who need your faith and God to use your faith so he can act through you for their sake. This is about other people. This is faith for the sake of other people, not just you. You see that? Now, what's that make you think? As we read through this short little story together and we begin to ponder why this might be so very important for us. Well, I will tell you that initially, my reaction to this is, then my faith must be smaller than I think. Follow the logic here. Jesus says, if you have faith in God the size of a tiny seed, which is not that big, then God will be able to do through you seemingly impossible things. You will be able to intervene in seemingly hopeless situations and see God act, see God move, see God do extraordinary things. If it takes that little for God to act through me, then I have to candidly and in all humility say, my faith sometimes is smaller than a mustard seed because God does not always use me that way. I suspect my feelings in response to this passage are just like his disciples that day. They were thinking to themselves, wait a minute, we were doing exactly what you told us to do. We were going around to the little towns and squares and hamlets all over northern Israel called Galilee. We were teaching what you told us to teach. We were doing what you told us to do. And yet, it is humbling to realize in doing all that, sometimes their faith in God was smaller than a mustard seed. See, I think for people like me, and maybe you'll admit people like you, we can walk around with the illusion that we trust God far more than we actually really do. We wake up and think, I trust God today. In fact, it's an assumption that we no longer question. I'm a Christian person. I am down with this Jesus thing. Therefore, it means I actively trust God today, yes? You know what shakes us out of that slumber and makes us realize that maybe we don't trust God nearly as much as we think? Impossible situations, just like in the passage. All of a sudden, you face something in your life that you can't fix. You can't figure out. You can't find a way through. Or someone you care about faces something similar. Or somebody, a neighbor around you faces something similar. And all of a sudden, you face it. Wow. I'm panicked. I'm worried. I'm anxious. Because maybe I don't trust God the way that I thought I did. If mustard seed size faith is all that's required for God to use you mightily in the lives of other people, then I have to admit sometimes my faith must not be that big. What is it that gets in your way of trusting God just that little bit? Let me draw your attention to two things from the passage that got in the way that day, that maybe were the stumbling blocks for Jesus' own disciples and why they couldn't be the instrument of change for this epileptic boy. Number one, the crowds got in the way. That's why Jesus was so irked at them. The people surrounding the situation were so full of doubt, sought to undermine what was possible and impossible, that they got in the disciples' heads and the disciples' ears. And you probably know what that's like, to have people around you tell you that you should not trust God the way that you're trying to, or the way that you're encouraged to. That you're being silly for going out on a limb for Jesus. You know what that's like. It could even be other Christian people that do that to you. Christian people are not immune from undermining the faiths of other people. The crowd sometimes are our problem. Instead of encouraging one another and helping us grow in our faith, what we do is diminish it for one another. How's that been like for you? Here's the other thing that happened that day. It was the size of the problem. This was not a little issue. This was a lifelong illness that was life-threatening, socially embarrassing for this epileptic boy and his family. And you can put yourself in the place of the disciples and you can feel what they would have felt. This father brings this very ill son to you and says, will you pray over him? Put your hands on him. Ask God to do for him the impossible. What would you have done? How much would you have believed? I'll admit it. There are days that would have been very hard for me. I would have overthought it and underfaithed it. And it would have been extraordinarily hard for me to have faith the size of a mustard seed in the face of that situation. Sometimes the situations in your life seem just as impossible. Or, more appropriately, in the vein of the passage, the situations in the lives around you that are crying out for you to step in and be the voice and hands of Jesus just seem that impossible. And they work against your faith. So if it's true that it takes only faith the size of a mustard seed to make an extraordinary impact in a life, then I have to admit sometimes mine must not be that big. Here, however, is the converse. If it's true, according to Jesus, that it only takes mustard seed-sized faith to make life-transforming difference in somebody else's life, then this is open to everybody. Everybody. This is not just for a few. This is not just for spiritual superstars. It is open to everybody. The disciples that day had known Jesus for somewhere between 6 to 18 months. How well do you think they understood Jesus? By the time he said to them, now stop listening to me and go out and teach other people what I've told you. Stop letting me do for you, and I want you to go out and do for others. Stop letting God do for you through me, and instead go to others and let God do for others through you. I mean, the truth is they were novices. There are people in this room today who have been Christians, listen, 10 times, 20 times, as long as those guys that day. If they could do what Jesus was asking them to do, then so can you. No one is excluded. Everyone can have that little faith. I understand you have doubts. I understand you have questions about Christianity to which you don't have answers. Get over it. That's always going to be the case. I understand you don't feel like you understand it all. I understand that you don't think you have but a few small answers in your hand. And all you really have is the way that Jesus has gripped your heart and your life and the way that he has tugged at your soul to follow him. You think, who am I to go and do life-transforming work among other people, you're just like they were. That's who you are. We are all like the disciples. And if it really is about only having a little faith in order to be used in huge ways, then no one is excluded. Not the person in the room with the least amount of faith, in fact. What could you do this week to trust God just a little bit more? Follow the logic here. Let's assume you're like me, and on occasion you struggle with how much you actually trust God. Maybe specifically to make a difference in a life to which God is pointing you. And you think to yourself, well, I must not trust God that much because I haven't yet summoned the courage to go to this life and to speak hope to it, invest my time and my love in it, etc. Okay, great. So your faith is less than the size of a mustard seed. Given that a mustard seed is very, very small, what small steps can you take to increase the size of your tiny faith? Because here's the thing, the bar is set really, really low. All it's got to be is the size of a seed, and you will start to see God use you. What could you do? Maybe all you do this week is you wake up every day and you say, God, I am going to trust you today. You know I'm not great at it, but I'm going to wake up today and I'm going to pray to you that I'm going to trust you today. And you can lead me into conversations or situations in which I promise my first instinct is going to be not to freak out, not to be afraid, not to run away, not to be indifferent, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to trust you in that moment to lead me, to give me the words I need, to show me what to do to make an impact. You think by doing that one small thing, your faith, which in your own assessment is smaller than a mustard seed, would very quickly, in short order, become larger than a mustard seed? I'll bet yes. Jesus' point to us should be very freeing. It doesn't take much trust in God to be used in extraordinary ways in the lives of other people. And if you don't feel like you trust God that much, great. Just do something small to increase it, and you'll find in short order it's big enough. It's big enough. Jesus says that if we are willing to have faith that is just the size of a mustard seed, then there is nothing around you in your world, among your friends and your neighbors, that remains impossible. There is no such thing as a hopeless situation anymore. That father that day had been waiting his entire son's life for someone to come along and to have enough faith to ask God to heal his son. And sure enough, it happened. Can you imagine what it would have been like for that father to wait that long for someone to believe that God could make a difference in the life of his afflicted child? I got news for you. There are people in your world today. There are going to be people in your world tomorrow who are waiting just like that dad. And they're waiting for you, or someone like you, who is willing to have a little bit of faith and believe that God can make a monumental difference in a life. But for whatever reason, their faith is shaky enough or weak enough or non-existent enough that they need you to bring your faith into it. They need to borrow your faith to believe that God can transform who they are and what their life is. Will you go? Will you be on mission with Jesus like the disciples were that day? Or will your lack of faith in God get in the way? If it's true that small faith is all that's required to make a big difference, then this should give every person in the room tremendous courage. You're right. You're not perfect. There are still big gaps and holes in your life. If someone were to ask you if you follow Jesus to the letter, every verse, your answer would be no. Awesome. You're just like them. But that should not stop you from exercising extraordinary faith for the sake of other people who desperately need it. What would it look like this week for you to take a step of faith into a very difficult situation in the lives around you? It could be small and simple. It could be you reaching out to someone who lives in isolation that they have imposed upon themselves because they no longer trust anybody. And you're willing to say, I will enter into that with faith and courage, knowing that I can draw them to Jesus and his love through my little mustard seed-sized faith. Maybe you have a friend who's given up, and all they've done is walked through the routine of their work and their recreation for weeks, even years now. And they are more robot than human, more zombie than alive. And into that life, your tiny little faith can enter, pleading with God Almighty to do for them what only he can do, to wake them up, to find meaning and purpose, to find friends, community, service. This is what you can do. Nothing is impossible, Jesus says, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed. So I want to ask you again, how much faith do you have in God today? Is it proportional to what Jesus said you needed to have? But maybe more importantly, how do you know? How do you know how much faith in God you have? According to this passage in Matthew chapter 17, the answer to that question is this. Are you willing to enter into seemingly impossible, hopeless situations that others won't touch? And are you willing to exercise just a little bit of faith, believing that God will use your efforts and courage to effect great change? That is the answer to how much faith you have. And if you are not willing to do that, and to begin to learn to extend yourself to other people, then maybe like me, you have to admit on occasion your faith isn't that big at all. And what difference does your faith make? Well, only this. There are lives around you trapped today. There are lives around you today that have given up the dream of having love and hope, joy and peace. There are lives around you today that believe they have hit their ceiling and their ceiling is low. That they can be and do nothing more than what they already are. And those lives are waiting on you. And your mustard seed-sized faith. And what you will see as you exercise patience and endurance, as you enter into those lives with great trust in God, is that he will use little old you and your little old faith to make a big, life-changing impact in others. Take a minute here in at the end of the message, and why don't you allow God to give you some direction about some of the hopeless, impossible, difficult situations around you in your life and the lives of your neighbors and friends and family. And I want you to pray about those things. I want you to pray in faith about those things. And then I want you to take the next step and ask God to make you willing and courageous enough to find ways to step into those situations. Would you do that? Take a minute to do that, and then I will pray for us all.